So hi, my name is Heather Weiner. I'm a coastal scientist at the Washington State Department of Ecology. And as introduced, I'll be discussing some beach monitoring our group has been doing near Kalaloch. Next slide, please. First, I'll describe the study area and location and setting. Then I'll talk about the background and motivation for our work and go over some of our main research questions. For 3 of those questions, I'll describe how we're collecting data and some of the results that we're seeing. And then I'll review some of the key takeaways of the work we have so far. Next slide. So our study area for this work is in the Kalaloch area of Olympic National Park along the coast near the South Beach campground. The Kalaloch Lodge is just to the north of this map if you're familiar with the area. Next slide. This stretch of shoreline consists of a sandy foreshore lower on the beach and a cobble berm higher on the beach. This is called a composite beach since it's made up of both sand and gravel or cobble. And the beach is backed by a bluff that has been pretty stable over time. Next slide. As coastal scientists, we're interested in studying composite beaches because they're more resilient than sandy beaches, which can be more vulnerable to overtopping, flooding, and erosion. And the cobbles on the upper beach absorb wave energy and can move around with it, which naturally protects the uplands. There tends to be less in the scientific literature about these types of beaches. Next slide. Because of the resilience demonstrated by natural composite beaches, this has led engineers to design shoreline stabilization structures called dynamic revetments, which try to emulate the cobble berm of composite beaches. In these photos, you'll see how similar the natural cobble berm at South Beach near Kalaloch, which is shown on the left, looks to a built dynamic revetment shown on the right at North Cove, which is at the mouth of Willapa Bay. Dynamic revetments are currently seen as an effective nature-based approach to protect from upland erosion that can work in a high-energy environment. And they differ from hard armor, which is static and made of larger material that reflects wave energy. However, since it is a relatively new type of solution compared to those more conventional measures, there's no published engineering guidance for dynamic revetments at this time. So this can lead to challenges during design and management, and is why monitoring of these structures to understand how they behave is so important. Next slide. For our monitoring work at South Beach, our main research questions and objectives include things like, what is the shape of the beach? How does it change over time or seasonally? What size are the cobbles? What's the sorting like across the beach? And does this change with time? How far do the cobbles move? Where do they go? And these questions will help us get at bigger objectives, like how can we apply this information to inform engineering design? Under what conditions do dynamic revetments work? And can we use what we learn to inform management of these structures and estimate maintenance requirements? So I'm going to focus on the questions in blue, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how we're monitoring and what we found so far. Next slide, please. First, I'll talk about how we monitor the shape or topography of the beach. It's important to understand things like how wide is the berm, what elevation is the crest, what is the slope, and how are these features changing so that we can inform future design, implementation, and management of the dynamic revetment structures. Next slide. So to measure the topography of the beach and berm, we use survey grade GPS receivers mounted to backpacks and walk along predefined transects to collect elevation data. The map on the left here shows our 14 transects at South Beach in blue, which are oriented perpendicular to shore and are spaced 100 meters apart, some 50 meters spaced in the middle of the survey area. We began collecting these transects in February of 2019, and we surveyed them seasonally. So we've done 20 surveys over the past 4+ years. In addition to the cross-shore profiles, we also walk along the cobble berm toe to delineate its position every season, which is shown on the bottom right photo. Next slide. Here is a plot of our cross-shore profile data. So on the y-axis is elevation and x is cross-shore distance. The plot is showing an average of all 14 profiles per season, so it's averaged across space and time. The average winter profile is shown in blue, spring is green, summer is yellow, and fall is maroon. Moving from left to right on the plot is the sandy beach on the left, shown by the solid line, and then up the cobble berm on the right side of the plot, which is shown by dashed lines, and there you can see there's vertical exaggeration here. The colored circles show the average position of the cobble berm toe each season. And the faint gray lines in the background are just all the profiles that we've collected, just to give you an idea of the range that we're seeing. The yellow and green lines show that in spring and summer, the beach is higher in elevation. The The extra sand on the beach covers the lower part of the cobble berm, so the elevation of the berm toe is higher on the beach face during those seasons. And in fall and winter, those blue and maroon lines, larger waves pull the sand offshore, so the elevation of the beach is lower. The cobble berm toe is lower on the beach face as well. You can see that on average, the berm shape and crest elevation are more stable through time. Go to the next slide now. Here are some plots that further examine the elevation and position of the berm toe through time. The main takeaway here is that the toe of the cobble berm has varied by about 3 meters in elevation and 20 meters in cross-shore position between seasons, again being higher and more landward in the spring and summer, and then lower and more seaward in the fall and winter. Despite these seasonal fluctuations, the position of the berm toe has been pretty steady through time. Next slide. This shows some photos taken from the same location in the winter and summer last year, just to illustrate what it looks like when the berm toe is lower in the winter in those top photos, and then covered in sand in the summer, which is the bottom photos. Next slide, please. And these plots illustrate some different metrics that we can pull out of our beach profile data. This is comparing the width and slope of the beach and the berm averaged across the different seasons. We see that in spring and summer, when the beach is wider, as seen in that top left plot, the berm is narrower and steeper because the toe is higher. And in fall and winter, the beach is narrower, but the berm is wider and less steep, providing a large area for winter storm waves to be dissipated. And maybe you saw that in the previous photo on the previous slide. Next slide, please. We also want to examine the size of the cobbles and their sorting over time. Next. To answer these questions, we use a technique known as cobble cam, where we collect digital photos of the surface sediments and analyze the grain size using computer algorithms. Photos are taken at fixed elevations along the same beach profiles that we collect topographic data. Next slide, please. Using the photos, we can calculate the median grain size for each sample and plot it on the beach profile. Same as before, here elevation is on the y-axis, cross-shore distance is on the x-axis. The black line is showing the 2D profile of the beach, and the colored dots here are representing the median grain size at each elevation. Next. On this profile, you can see that the lower two samples are mostly made up of medium-sized sand, the blue dots there. And on the lower berm face, the median grain size is coarse gravel, which is the yellow dots. And then there is very coarse gravel on the upper berm face near the crest of the berm. Those are the orange dots. This is characteristic of cobble berms where larger grains are moved to higher elevations across the profile by large winter waves. Next slide, please. We can also look at the breakdown of the grain size distribution within each sample, which is shown here by these colored pie charts. The smaller pie charts on the top show the distribution of grain sizes for each sample that we collected, and the bottom is averaged across the entire profile. On this profile, most of the grains in the sample were coarse gravel, which is that yellow wedge of the pie chart. And our next steps will be to compare these distributions alongshore within the study area and over time. Next slide, please. The last question I'll talk about is cobble movement. If we can learn whether the cobbles are moving alongshore or staying in place, this can just help us to talk about maintenance and adaptive management of revetments. Next slide, please. So to answer this, we've been tracking individual cobbles using radio frequency identification, or RFID. We collected and tagged 150 cobbles from South Beach. We measured, weighed, and photographed them. We then deployed the tagged rocks on the beach in October of 2019. We placed the rocks at 3 different elevations on the berm face along 5 of the central transects in our survey area, which is that little yellow box there. Since then, we've been going out to do tracking using the RFID antennas to locate the cobbles and survey their location. And at some point, we might like to try to recover them to measure and reweigh them to see if they changed at all. Next slide, please. Here, the map in the center shows the location of the tagged cobbles at the time of our last rock tracking survey last March. Their locations are colored by elevation they were found. So blue is lower on the beach, while yellow, orange, and red are higher up. And then their original placement locations are shown by the black dots near the center of our survey area. You'll notice that the cobbles are spread out all along the beach, moving both north and south from their original location. We've measured up to 460 meters of movement. The plot in the lower right shows our recovery rate, and over the past couple of years, we've only been finding about 30% of the rocks that were placed, and it's likely that a lot of the rocks are buried or have moved outside our study area. The next step is going to be to look at the size and shape data we have and see if that correlates with the distance moved. Next slide. So that was a quick synopsis of all the monitoring work we're doing in this beach near Kalaloch. And here are some key takeaways. That sediment is moving onshore in summer, covering the lower part of the berm. It's wider and steeper in the wider and less steep in the winter. So there's a larger area for waves to dissipate, which just naturally protects the uplands. And larger cobbles are usually found at the top of the berm. Cobbles are moving both north and south along this area. And again, we're hoping that the things we learn from observing this natural cobble berm will help inform the design or management of built dynamic revetments that we're seeing along our coast. So that is it. Next slide, I guess. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.
Wow, great. Thanks a lot, Heather. That's really cool stuff. Yeah, really nice work. And we are open for questions. I'm trying to track what's in. Let's see. Oh yeah, there's a question Curtis is asking in the chat with regards to the excellent use of tags and to what depth can they be read.
I'm sorry, I was distracted by the chat. Can you say that again?
I know it is distracting.
Yeah.
What depth can you actually read the RFID tags?
Yeah.
How buried can they get?
Right. So so the antenna that we use is you can't see what I'm doing, but something like this around, and I think we can track them to about 1 meter depth, and it depends on the way that the tag is actually oriented in the rock. So if it's perpendicular, we get a better, stronger signal. But I think in theory we can get them up to 1 meter buried. And we do find that in the sand area, we do like measure their location, but they're under sand. So we don't find the exact rock, but we measure their location on the sand.
Great. Another question. I think some of these look like they've been answered. How do different amounts of wave energy affect the size of the berm and the type of the nature-based solution you might want to try?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that's something that we're going to get into next. We haven't quite dug into the wave climate and how that ties into the changes that we're seeing. So stay tuned.
Great. Okay, and then I have a quick question about your tagged rocks, which is along the lines of you said you recovered about 30% of them. I may have missed initially. Were they all approximately the same size, or did you do a gradient of sizes that you initially tagged? And those 30% that you are finding, were those of where did those fit in the size frequency distribution of what you tagged?
Yeah, that's a good question. We tagged a range of sizes that were found on the beach. So from the smaller ones, the smallest, I can't remember what the smallest tag size we have is, just a few, maybe 1 centimeter or something. So we have some smaller pebble-sized rocks, and then up to like the larger cobbles that you would find on the beach. So we did do a range, and we deployed a range at different elevations on the beach too. So we tried to mix it up. But we have not yet correlated the size and weight data that we took to how they've been moving. So that's on the to-do list as well.
Wonderful. And 2 other questions, one from Bob Vedas, and I'll answer this one, which is how do these affect razor clams? They don't really, because these cobble berms are well above the razor clam beds. And actually down in South Beach, there actually are, the razor clam beds are a little bit more coarse than they are further up on Kalaloch Beach, but and as a result, there tend to be fewer razor clams down there. So there are some sediment characteristics there for razor clams. Sorry for poaching your time on that. I guess an additional question, and then we'll have to move on, has to be whether you've looked at wobble stones used by Bruce McVicker at the University of Waterloo.
I cannot say that I have. That's the first time I've heard that word. So I put that on the list of things for us to look into. Yeah, thanks for that.
Great. Well, I mean, if you're going to coin a term, wobble stone's got to be it, right? That's a pretty cool term. Okay, Heather, thanks a lot for the fascinating talk. And people have your contact information and can further query you on that.